Hey everyone, this is Anson. I'm going to show you how to use guards in NestJS. So guards are pretty straightforward. They pretty much just protect your API routes. So sometimes you might have an API endpoint that needs to have the user authenticated, either via Passport.js with a session and a cookie, or they need to have a valid access token like a JSON web token. So instead of having your route method handle all of that checks, you have to check to see if the user is actually logged in or check to see if the JSON web token is valid. Instead of doing all of that in the route method, you can actually just abstract it away into the guard. So the guard kind of intercepts the request. It sits in front of the route handler. You can look at this diagram right over here. It sits in front of the route handler and it will process incoming HTTP requests. And the guard itself has a method called canActivate. And that method just returns a Boolean value, true or false. And so if it returns true, that means it grants the request. So it passes the request down to the route handler. If the canActivate method returns false, then that pretty much means that the guard is rejecting the request. So it will send a status code, an error status code back to the client side. Okay, so this is very useful if you want to ensure that an endpoint has proper validation, has proper authentication before that endpoint performs any logic at all. So that way you don't receive unwanted requests. You can also use it to check for roles. So sometimes you might have an application that has different roles that define the scope of permission of what the user can and can't do. So you can use guards to also check for the roles as well. And really anything that has to deal with authorization and authentication, you can put that inside a guard. So now I'll show you some examples of how to use them. So right now I have a very basic project set up. I only have this user's controller and it's using this user's endpoint. So when I make a GET request to /users, it's going to go ahead and invoke this getUser method. And of course we have our user's controller registered in the app module. So if I go to my Thunder client and make a GET request to localhost /users, you can see I get this object sent back as a response. So everything is working good. So what I want to show you is I want to show you how we can use a guard to protect this getUser route right over here. Let's say we don't want certain people to be able to visit this endpoint, maybe because they are not authenticated or their access token expired or whatever it is. You want to implement some kind of mechanism to authorize requests. So I'm going to go ahead into my source folder, and I'll create a new folder, and I'll call it guards. And I'll create a new file, and I'll call this auth.guard.ts. Now, every guard in NestJS is going to be a class. So, let's go ahead and create a class and export it. And I'm going to call this auth guard, just like this. Now, there are three things I need to do. First, let's actually mark our class as an injectable. And then we need to implement this interface called canActivate. And then after we implement this interface for auth guard, we want to actually implement the method canActivate like this. And now this method takes in one argument. It takes in the execution context. So I'll type annotate it with execution context like that. And all of these classes and interfaces are being imported from the same package at NestJS /common. Now the canActivate method returns a Boolean. It can also return a promise Boolean because it could be asynchronous, or you can also have it return an observable. And keep in mind that this is imported from RxJS observable, but it has to overall be a Boolean. So the execution context actually allows you to get access to a bunch of metadata as well as the request and response object in case if you need it. Typically, you will need it inside your authentication guard because usually your request object is going to have properties such as the headers, the request headers, where your access tokens will be sent via. So you'll attach it in the headers. Cookies, if you need to validate cookies. You might have a user property on the request object if you're using a library such as Passport.js for authentication. So I'll show you how to get the request object. So first, let's declare a variable, call it request, and I'm going to reference context. And what you're going to do is you're going to reference this switch to HTTP method because we're using HTTP. Now, of course, if you're using something else, let's say if you're using RPC, then you can use switch to RPC. This one over here, switch to WS, that's for WebSocket. So depending on what it is that you need to do, you can switch to the appropriate context. So in our case, we're using HTTP, so we're going to switch to HTTP. And then you can see right over here, I can call getRequest, and this will give me back the request object. So you'll notice that the type of this return value of getRequest is any. You can actually type annotate this using the request interface, which comes from Express. So let's make sure we import request from Express. And then now you'll see that right over here, if I hover over, I can see that it is properly being type annotated using the correct interface. And I can reference request dot, and I can reference headers, I can reference the request body, the route parameters, anything I want. So now at this point, you can go ahead and do whatever you want inside this canActivate method. So you can take the request object and you can check the headers, you can check to see if there is an access token, you can check the request body, you can check to see if the user property is defined on the request object, which just basically means that they are authenticated in the context of Passport.js. You can do whatever you want. The overall thing inside this canActivate method is that you must return a Boolean. So if you return true, what this means is you're saying, hey, we're returning true. We can actually approve this request and allow it to go through. So if the user makes a request to my endpoint, let's just say get users, and I have this auth guard applied to it, and since we're returning true, we're basically allowing the request to go through, and we'll send back the response of this object right over here. If we return false instead, then that means, okay, reject the request. That's literally all it means. So obviously this is a very simple example, but ideally in your application, you're going to have some more complex logic that you want to apply onto the incoming request to make sure that you are not just giving back a response to unauthorized users. So we'll keep things simple because I really want to show you how everything works instead of adding all of these different logic, which is going to make it more complex. I'm going to write a simple console log in the canActivate method so you can see that it's going to be called. I'm going to just say inside auth guard, and let's go into our user controller. And now in order to apply this guard for our endpoint, for this get user endpoint right over here, we need to bind it by using the use guard decorator, use guards decorator. And that's going to be imported from NestJS/common. And over here, you just pass in your guards. So I'm going to pass in auth guard like this. So I'm going to pass in the class as if it was an argument. So NestJS will take care of injecting the auth guard instance via dependency injection, or you can just pass it like this if you wanted to create your own instance. But we can just do it like this. So now let's go ahead and just double check our console, make sure there's no errors. Good. Let's go to Thunder Client, and now let's make a GET request. So you can see that it sends back a 200, and of course that should make sense because in our canActivate method, we are returning true, which means approve the request. If you look at the logs, you see how right now we are logging inside auth guard. So this proves that the guard is actually being invoked. The guard's canActivate method is being invoked. So we are definitely going through the guard. Now, if I were to return false instead, maybe the user didn't have the correct access token or their access token expired, whatever it is, then you want to return false. So let's go back to Thunder Client. If I make a GET request, You see how now it gives me back a 403 forbidden, and it gives me this message, this error. So that's the auth guard underneath the hood handling it. So it's saying, okay, we're returning false, so we're just going to send back an HTTP exception and send back a status code of 403. So we're basically rejecting the request because the auth guards can activate method said no, do not approve this request, return false, so reject the request. So that's really what's going on. So hopefully this makes sense. And you can apply as many guards as you want. Right now I only have one, but you'll see that you can apply literally as many guards as you want. So you might have a complex layer of authorization where you want to check the guard, and you also want to check perhaps maybe roles and other stuff. So let's go ahead and move on. I just want to show you very quickly that let's say if you had multiple endpoints. So let me create another endpoint right here. And let me set this endpoint to be users. Let's just do test for now. I can't really think of a good name right now. Get user test. Okay, and then if I go to user/test, let's see what's going on. Not sure what was going on with that, but you can see now I'm getting back the correct object, the correct response. And let's say I wanted to apply this auth guard to this get user test method as well. So I could do the same thing. I could use the use guards decorator as well for this request method. And if I click send, you can see now the guard is working. But if I wanted to apply the guard to, let's say, all of the request methods inside this user controller class, which is ideal because you sometimes want to make sure that an entire controller is protected and only authorized users can access it. So instead of applying it manually on each request method, you can actually just apply it once on the controller level by using the use guards decorator on the user controller class like this. So now if I click send, you'll see that our guard still works just fine for both endpoints, and I only applied it on the class right over here. So this will save you perhaps a few lines of code. You can also apply it globally as well. So let me remove this line. I'm going to go into main.ts, and then we're going to reference our Nest app instance. So app.useGlobalGuards. You're going to call this method, and then you're going to pass an instance of your auth guard. So in this case, you actually need to pass an actual created instance like this, so new auth guard. And then now you'll see that if I try to make a request, it's not going to allow me to get to that request because I applied it globally. So I turn it off, you can see that now I get the response back. So hopefully that makes sense. Just wanted to show you all that very quickly. Now what I want to do is I want to show you how we can actually configure roles for our request method. So let's say, for example, you only want a user that is logged in with certain roles to be able to access our get user method or the endpoint. And if they don't have, let's say, the admin role, then they cannot access this endpoint at all. So we want to reject that request. So what we can do is, since NestJS doesn't have a built-in roles decorator, which is fine because they actually recommend that you create your own roles decorator. It's also based on the docs as well. So what we can do is, let's first create a new folder. Let's call it decorators. And I'll create a new file called roles.decorator.ts. And a decorator, remember, is literally just a function. So that's really all we're doing, is just creating a function. So I'm going to go ahead and call this roles with a capital R. And then we want to import this reflector class from @nestjs/core. And then we want to call this static method called createDecorator. And it literally is just a helper function that creates a decorator for you. And what this will allow you to do is literally apply metadata onto our request handler. So we just call it like this. And then what we want to do additionally is we want to type annotate this createDecorator with string array like this. So now what we can do after creating our roles decorator is we can just use it like a regular decorator for the route that we want to add roles metadata to. So let's say, for example, for this get user request handler, so that's for the get users endpoint. Let me actually write a comment up here, so that way we don't get confused. So right over here, I would just use at roles like this. I'm going to hit enter, and that's going to import my roles decorator. And you just call it because it's a function. And you can see now it expects an array of strings, optional. And now I can specify what roles that I want the user to have in order for them to access this endpoint. Now, of course, this doesn't automatically check the roles for us. We still need to write the logic ourselves. All we're really doing is just attaching the metadata to this request handler. We're still going to need to actually get the roles that we applied to this roles decorator. And then we need to write some logic to check to see if the user actually has the role. But I can go ahead and set up some basic roles. So administrator, like that. And I'll show you now how we can actually access the roles metadata. So basically this array right over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another guard, and I'll call this roles.guard.ts. Remember, you can have as many guards as you want. So over here, we'll do the same thing that we did for our auth guard. So I'm just going to actually copy my auth guard, and I'll just paste it inside roles guard. And I'll just change the name of auth guard to roles guard. Like that. And let me remove this. So I'm inside my roles guard. Just for an example, I'm going to return true. And I just want to show you very quickly what happens when I apply multiple guards to this get users endpoint. So we still need to use the use guards decorator, of course. Let's first apply the auth guard, and let's apply the roles guard. So we're going to import that from roles.guard.ts file. Now, one thing to remember is that guards are called in the order that they are bound. So for example, over here, I bound the auth guard first and then the roles guard. So it's going to go ahead and invoke auth guards can activate method first. So that's why right over here you see inside auth guard. But because we're returning false, it's going to reject the request. So it doesn't call the next roles guards can activate method. So let me change this to true right now. And let me send the request again. And you can see now it says inside auth guard and then inside roles guard right over here. So you can see that it's calling it in that order. So what we want to do is let's just let auth guard return true. So we'll allow the request to go through. Then we're going to go to the next guard. So we'll let the roles guard take care of checking to see if the user has the correct role. So now in order to actually get the roles applied to this request handler, this get user method, we need to first inject this reflector instance in the constructor. So private reflector, and we're going to type annotate it with the reflector class. So this is literally the same exact reflector class that we just used to create the decorator. Okay. And what we can do is we can reference the reflector, and I can call this get method right here. And what I can do is I can actually pass in the decorator that I created, so roles, like an argument. So let me do that. So I'm going to import roles from the roles.decorator.ts file. Again, that's this roles decorator that we just created. So I'm passing that as an argument. And then what I can do is I can go ahead and specify the target. So the target here is going to actually just be context.getHandler. So remember, aside from the execution context allowing us to get the request object or the response object, we can actually also get the handler as well. And what I mean by handler is that is this get user method that is going to be called for that request. Okay, so we pass in this get handler, and then what will happen is this will return to us the string array. I'm going to assign it to this roles variable right over here. So whatever it was that I type annotated this to, so let's say if I did number, right? And then if I see over here, now you can see that the type annotation of roles is number, or number array, sorry, number array. Let me just change this back to a string array from a number array. Just wanted to show you how that alters the type that is returned from reflector.get. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference roles like this. And what we'll log in the console is literally all of the roles that we applied to this get user request handler. So right now I only have one role configured for this endpoint, which is administrator. So if I make a request right now, if you look at the logs, you can see that it is logging this array and it has administrator. If I were to go back to my controller for get user request method, and if I added more, so let's say if I added moderator, let's do manager, just whatever, this is just an example. Click send. You can see that all of those roles are now being logged to the console. So you can literally configure whichever roles you want. Okay, cool. So now at this point, what you would want to do is you would want to take this roles array. This tells us what roles are required. You know what? Let me rename this to required roles. So that way we don't get confused. So what we would need to do is, depending on how you are authenticating users, because like I said, if you're using Passport.js, then this request object that I showed you how to get, let me do that again. Context dot switch to HTTP dot get request. So this request object would have this user property right over here. Because if you're using Passport.js, when they serialize the user to the session, what they also do is they also attach this user property to the request object itself, and then they attach the authenticated user to that user property. Okay, so you can use request.user, and depending on how you have your models set up for your database, your user property might have this roles property as well. And then you can go ahead and take the user roles and check to see if the user has all of these required roles. You can check to see if the user has administrator, moderator, or manager, just as an example. So just a very simple example. What I'll do is I'll leave these roles like this. Instead, I'm actually going to change this to two roles. We'll do administrator and owner. And I'm going to go ahead and set up a fake user. And we'll just set a username of Anson. And let's do roles. So for the roles, we'll do administrator, owner, moderator, and let's just do guest. So of course, if you're the owner of the application or the platform, then you're going to have likely all of the permissions. And of course, the owner role is likely going to be the highest privileged role. It has all the permissions. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that whatever user this is, whatever fake user is, whoever it is, we don't know who it is. We want to make sure that that fake user has all of these roles. So it has administrator and owner. So what I can do is inside my canActivate method for my roles guard, I can use an if statement and I can reference required roles like this. And since this is an array, I can use this every method on the array. And what I want to do is I want to check to see if every role inside this required roles array is inside the fake user.roles array. So essentially, I'm just making sure that every element inside this roles array right over here that we set for our endpoint is also going to be found inside the user's roles array as well. So I can do that using the every method. So what I'll do is I'll pass in a callback function, which is going to be our predicate function. So that takes in an argument, so required role, and this is going to be a string. And I want to check to see if that string is inside fake user.roles. So I'm going to reference fake user.roles, and I can use this includes method. And since it's a string, it's going to be very easy to search for it. So I'm just going to pass required role like this. And if at any point, if let's say if there is one element inside required rules that is not found inside our fake user.rules array, then this is going to return false. Okay, you can even read about over here that it makes sure that it tests to see if the predicate function passes for every single element in the required rules array. And if it doesn't, then it's going to return false. So let's say if this returns true, then we're just going to go ahead and write a console log. I'll say user has every required rule, and then we'll just return true. And if not, we'll return false. And I could change this to a ternary operator, but I'm just going to leave it like this for now. So let's go ahead and test this out. So right now, my fake user has all 4 of these roles, and for this endpoint, we only require 2 of those 4 roles that the user has. So our user should be able to access this endpoint. You can see that we're still able to access it just fine. Now notice how if, let's say, I remove the owner role from the fake user, you can see now it says forbidden resource. Let's say if I remove administrator and save, it's going to say forbidden. If I remove both, then obviously this should not work. If I leave the 2 and remove just moderator, I still get access to it. If I remove guest, I still get access to the endpoint. If I remove both moderator and guest, I get access to the endpoint. And let's just say, for example, I'm going to add these 2 roles to this endpoint right here. So the user must have all 4 of these roles, which our fake user does. You can see that it's still passing. If I remove one of the roles from the fake user, then it fails because the user does not have all the required roles. So hopefully this makes sense. And again, keep in mind that you also have to make sure that your logic applies to your application. Right now, this is only working for my application. I just want to show you a simple example. But if your application has additional logic that you need to process, then you need to make sure that you do that. Otherwise, it's just not going to work the way they expect. But I hope that this example can at least show you how you can set up role-based authentication. So what I'll do in the next video is I'm going to actually set up JWT, or also pronounced JOT. And what we're going to do is we're going to save users to an array, and then we're going to create some fake authentication system. And then when we authenticate, we're going to use the JWT, the JOT, to sign the user. And then whenever the user authenticates, we need to check to see that the actual access token, the actual JOT that is passed in the header, is valid. If it is, we'll grant them the request, but then we're going to go ahead and go to the roles guard and make sure that they have the correct rules. So basically, I'm just taking this example from this video, but I'm going to use JWT or JOT, so that way you all better understand how to apply it to like a realistic scenario. So hopefully this all makes sense, and I will see you in the next episode. Peace out.